Welcome to a rather balmy Friday afternoon in Brisbane. Winter's definitely over, everyone. Where we are anyway. Hello, I am Chris Irons, Strata Advisor with Hines Legal, former Commissioner for Body Corporate and Community Management in Queensland. With me today, as always, Frank Higginson, partner, Hines. Frank, welcome.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Chris.
Thank you. Hello, everyone viewing us. A note to please like and share. The real benefit you get out of liking and sharing, by the way, yes, we obviously get a benefit out of it, but the real benefit you get is that by liking and sharing, we actually start to find out what it is that people want to know about, which in turn means that we get to deliver you the things you need to know. So by liking and sharing, it gets out there, it gets the discussion started. That's how we tailor what we're going to deliver to you every Friday. So please do that. Also, don't forget, you can ask questions of us today. We'll get through as many of those as we can in the time that we have. Just put a comment on Facebook. We'll get to those as we go along. Today, though, the thrilling, exciting topic of body corporate meetings. So, in my experience as Commissioner, I can tell you that the conduct of body corporate meetings, particularly general meetings, was the #1 most disputed about topic in the Commissioner's office, by far, actually. Why is that? I hear you cry. Frank, I'll start with you. Why do you think that's the most disputed about topic you can get?
Because people didn't get their way. You know, it's a bit like whinging about ScoMo, I suppose, in a sense, as Prime Minister. It's nothing you can do about it after the event. You've got to do things about it before the event, and sort of complaints about the outcome. So, and it's interesting, probably, as you might tell, ladies and gentlemen, these are all very, I wouldn't say on the hop, we decide a topic and then we have a chat about it, because this is how we've operated for years, even when Chris was Commissioner. So this one is straight off the top of our heads. And to be honest, mate, it's probably got a little bit of applicability across the country, because we're not talking, I think, specifically today about Queensland legislation in the sense of section 33.2b of the accommodation module says. As always with Chris's topics, where we're getting to is a lot of best practice type things. But usually unhappiness with meetings is unhappiness with the outcomes of the meetings. And then it's when the inquisition starts about, well, what should have happened here? Why didn't that happen there? Blah, 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 blah. And at that stage, usually it's too late.
That's right. That's right. And the other reason why is because meetings are full of moving parts, different moving parts. It is so easy for one of those parts to go wrong. When one part goes wrong, everything else typically goes wrong after that. So a couple of things to say at the start. Body corporate meetings are how decisions get made in a body corporate. So there's no one person who goes off and makes all the decisions. Body corporate manager, the caretaker, the chairperson, they don't have superhuman powers. It's all about group decision making according to very, very, very specific processes. So that's the first point to remember. Then the second point, and point that is frequently confused, body corporate meetings are one of two things. There are either general meetings or they're committee meetings. Frank, do you want to explain the difference?
Absolutely. So I suppose the best analogy I use for clients when sort of talking about body corporate decision making is you've got to think of a body corporate as if it's a company. So the committee is in effect the board of directors, and the lot owners are the shareholders. So the same as when you go to listed company environments, you've got a bunch of directors that'll make decisions about, for want of a better phrase, day-to-day style things, and then you've got a bunch of decisions that are reserved for the owners in general meeting. And the same as in the corporations law with listed companies and the rest of it, you must have an AGM once a year where directors are reaffirmed, certain statutory decisions are put to owners. So in Queensland, at least, that's confirmation of the minutes of the last meeting, a couple of budgets, decisions to audit, committee appointment, re-election, and then the rest of it becomes a little bit variable from time to time. So, and the way it works in Queensland, at least, is that basically a decision of the committee is a decision of the body corporate unless it's a decision on a restricted issue. And so restricted issues are things, I suppose the catch-all, Chris, is decisions that change the rights, privileges or obligations of owners. In Queensland, other things are commencing a proceeding other than a proceeding for recovery of levies. So before a body corporate can sue someone for breach of contract, for one of a better example, that needs approval at general meeting. So I suppose we operate on a almost committee can do everything but these restricted issues. And then after that, those other decisions are reserved for all of the owners. So the committee is a minimum 3, maximum 7. So those people can do the day-to-day stuff. And after that, if they can't make that decision, or more importantly, I suppose, if they choose not to, because just because they can make a decision doesn't mean they have to, if they throw it up to general meeting, it's up to all of the owners to decide.
And look, we could go on and on and on and on at length. We're giving a very general overview today. There would probably be separate meetings, separate webinars about general meetings and separate webinars about committee meetings, because they are actually quite different beasts. We're talking quite generally here today. We'll try, if there is a difference, we'll try and distinguish between general and committee meeting as we go along. We do actually have the specific do's and don'ts coming up, but just a couple more general points. All body corporate meetings follow some very, very strict timeframes and procedures. And to some people, it might seem incredibly convoluted, particularly if you've got a matter that is urgent. But there is a very good reason for that. And the main reason for that is to ensure fairness, transparency, and equity, and also to maximise participation. It's one of the reasons, for example, there is no business from the floor or agendas nominated from the floor. That is remarkably unfair on somebody who has put in their papers already to raise another matter from the floor. So body corporate legislation is incredibly prescriptive about what can and can't happen with a meeting. Frank, anything you want to add there?
No, absolutely. You know, you look at, I suppose, some elements of it are very open, and if you want to, the best example for that for me always is the number of committee meetings that must be held every year, which is not prescribed in any way, shape or form.
Yeah, that's right.
End of story. So a committee could meet once a week. It could not meet once at all. Whereas the AGM must happen once a year, and then there's a framework for how that, the statutory motions at least, must be considered.
Yep, absolutely. And probably one of the other points to cover off is that sometimes, Frank alluded to this earlier, that running a body corporate meeting is a bit like a company and a board of directors. One of the mistakes I have found people make is that they assume that a body corporate meeting is going to be and should be run like an incorporated association or another kind of group decision making. Yes, they're very similar things, that's true, but they're not the same, and the processes are not the same. So if you, for example, are used to being on the board of your local sporting association, which is incorporated, and then you decide to run your body corporate meeting the same way, you will find some problems that you'll run into. The basic concepts are the same, but there are some key differences. So make sure you have in your mind that difference. It's really important.
And you know, the difference I dislike the most is seconding of motions.
Yeah.
There is no scope for it in either general or committee meetings. And as much as usually we're a waste of time for us being at meetings, probably maybe 1 out of maybe 5 to 10, it's worth having a lawyer there in my experience. But maybe that's because people don't play up when lawyers are there too, who knows?
Yeah,
that seconding of motions just drives me to distraction, because there is absolutely no requirement for it at either committee or general meeting level. Yet the time you've sat in those meetings and people have asked for it and we're waiting for people to put their hands up, just stop.
That's a classic example of the difference. And one final point I mentioned, I'm just going to leave this one hanging for everyone today because it's its own webinar in itself. The thorny issue of conflict of interest when it comes to body corporate meetings. So here's a newsflash, which might surprise a lot of people. There is no conflict of interest provision at a general meeting. There's
a common motion and you can vote directly in favour of it.
And why is that? Because everyone at a general meeting is conflicted. They have to be, because they are voting for themselves and their interests first and foremost. There is very much a conflict of interest at committee level, and that's a different kettle of fish. But at a general meeting, no. So there's no need for someone to declare a conflict. They can if they want, and you would suggest it's good practice that they do, but they don't have to. No conflict of interest at general meeting. Let's leave that one for another webinar though, Frank, because there are a lot of thorny issues.
Because there's more than just meetings with conflicts of interest, aren't there?
So sure is.
That would be a really interesting one, I agree.
Sure is. But to the do's and the don'ts. Now, we haven't really talked about how we'll do this, Frank, but I am suggesting we actually alternate between do and don't. So I might kick off in the do list, give you the don'ts, and then we might swap at a certain point, and then I'll go don'ts and you can do do's. How does that sound?
Well, it'd be helpful if I had the list in front of me, which I don't.
Okay. Well, we won't be doing
No.
that then. Hang on, Frank is bringing up the list. I will kick it off nonetheless. So the very first do keep your details up to date. So do make sure your address and contact details are current. Why is that? Because you want to make sure you get the notice of the stupid meeting, frankly. But Frank, what's the don't there?
Hope that the body corporate manager will do it for you and will get the return to sender address and then ring you and try to figure it out. That's, yeah, it's like in Queensland, at least, there's a BCCM Form 8 where you are supposed to keep your details up to date. Interestingly enough, there's no actual legislative, I suppose, stated legislative intent yet with respect to the delivery of notices and everything else by email. That is coming whenever we get new regulation modules. So what will happen then is people's email addresses will form part of the record. And I think the last discussion, Chris, was that was going to be on an opt-out type basis. So if your email address is there, that will be your address for services notices unless you choose to opt out of it.
And so what the absolute numero uno best practice there, make sure you have an email address that is just for body corporate business only and not your personal one. It's the best thing you can do. The next do, and the other thing that you don't do is you don't set your spam filters. So emails from your body corporate management company don't get to you. That's a no-brainer, but it's happened many, many times, that one. The next do read your paperwork. Do read it. Because the don't, Frank, is that if you toss it in the bin
and you don't vote, you're in a world of pain. And I don't know how many times we've had that conversation with clients where they come to us, and I found the list now, Chris, so I'm now organised. They come to us complaining about the outcome of a motion. And the first question is, well, did you vote? No, I didn't. Makes it really, really hard to have a defensible position or to create an offensive position when you haven't even participated in the decision making in the first place.
That's right. If it goes to my former office, that's the first question they will ask as well. If you challenge that motion in my former office, you're going to get asked, did you vote? If your answer is no, then that's it. You don't really proceed any further at that point. It's an obvious one, but geez, the number of times when I have heard of it not happening. Yeah, anyway. So do ask questions and do get informed. So if you're presented with a bunch of agenda items that thick, read them, but don't, well, Frank will do the don't. Read them, go through them, make sure that you know what you're talking about, make sure that you understand. If there's a term or a word in there and you don't know what that means, find out what it means. Because, Frank, don't
blindly vote. It's sort of, as I suppose Scott Pape would say, choose your own path. Actually understand what it is that you're being asked to do and make a conscious decision in relation to it. I suppose, Chris, Churchill or otherwise, I think, well, was it the best argument against democracy is a 15-minute conversation with the average voter? I do know I've handed out how to vote cards across various political spectrums over the years, including independents. And it is interesting talking to people coming up in terms of what their questions might be about your particular candidate. So there is a degree of idiocy out there. And what I'd say is just make sure that's not you. Understand what it is that you're doing.
Yep. Particularly where money is involved. If you've got an item on the agenda that's got lots of zeros at the end of it, why on earth you would not ask questions about that before you vote is beyond me. The next do, I think you'll like this one in particular, Frank, or you'll like the don't in particular. So do seek further advice if you're not sure. I don't just mean legal advice here, or that's the obvious one, but you seek advice from somebody qualified to give it. So if there is something at the meeting about plumbing, ask a plumber. If there is a financial question, ask an accountant. If there is a question about wiring, ask an electrician. Get the further advice if you need to, because what you don't want, Frank,
is uninformed decision making and bush lawyer interpretations. I mean, I've been to a general meeting where it was a wool store down at Tenerife. So these things were built 100 years ago. Obviously magnificent buildings in their own right. They've subsequently been converted into residential. And one of the issues with a building that was built effectively for a life of 50 years back in the early 1900s, and it's still standing 100 years later, as things start to go wrong. So one of these general meetings, they had to replace these big massive beams that were across this open area, and they brought the engineer along to the meeting because to replace these things was a bucket load of money. And effectively the engineer said, you guys are actually lucky. This should have fallen over 20 or 30 years ago. So it's been exposed to the elements in Australia for a century. And it's still up there, and it's still relatively solid, but it's not going to last much longer. Yep. And I did have early days on a comment somewhere, I had someone have a chop at me about using the phrase bush lawyer in terms of being critical of our colleagues in the country from a legal profession perspective. Yeah. I said, no, that's not what it means. I have a significant degree of respect for all lawyers, particularly literal bush lawyers, because they do work that I wouldn't know the first thing about in terms of cattle farms, water licenses, sheep dips, contaminated land, whole bunch of stuff that is way beyond my pay grade. Yep. But the bush lawyer is someone that reads a section of the Act and then tries to force it down everyone else's throat and saying that's gospel. Well, that's absolutely wrong, because they didn't understand it doesn't apply unless this bit happens. And we get that all the time.
It happens all the time. Almost on a daily basis, both as commissioner and in this role, I would see something where somebody has leapt upon a section of the legislation and gone, right, that's it, I've got this right, not realizing that there may be 2 or 3 or even more other qualifying provisions which actually limit the operation of that.
What was it, 188,000 words in our strata legislation?
Yeah. So
some of them are inconsistent.
That's right. So yeah, the next one, but the next do. So do think about if you can participate on the day of the meeting, and if you are going to use another method, such as a paper vote, a proxy, or a power of attorney, make sure you have a good think about what that actually means, the implications of those. The flip side of that one, Frank, the don't,
is if you see people doing that and you're not happy with it, then do it yourself. You know, it's take control of your own destiny in these things. Sort of, it's and I suppose different states and different, even in Queensland, there's different legislative regimes for BUGTA buildings, Building Units and Group Titles Act buildings, and BCCM Act buildings. So that have different rules around proxies, different rules around powers of attorney or representatives, and even our modules, when we see them, are probably going to substantially limit the rights of people to attend meetings via powers of attorney. So, and again, this is one of those things in terms of, rather than complain about what other people are doing, if it's good enough for the goose, it's good enough for the gander. Get involved and have a go at it yourself. And even if it's just a matter of rallying the troops in terms of participating in the decision itself, because one of the big things, again, it's the difference between the electoral rate, the Australian electoral regime and the body corporate one, is that voting at body corporate level is not compulsory. So these things, most motions are decided on ordinary resolution basis, which means that it's passed if more people vote in favour of it than against it, of those who chose to vote. Yeah. So in a building of 100 units, 10 votes, 6 in favour, 4 against, means it's passed. Yep. So realistically, if you do a bit of lobbying, usually the outcomes can be substantially changed.
That's a really good point, Frank. I've heard so many times people say, oh, look, they've got all of those people in their pocket. They've manipulated the vote. They've got all of their mates to vote for them. Well, yeah, of course they do, because that's what they've done. The problems, the actual problems with that sort of stuff, there are specific things under legislation which are limited in terms of the use of proxies. You can actually put up motions to general meetings to prohibit proxies altogether. So if you think proxies are the worst thing and the devil's own work, put up a motion at a general meeting having them prohibited. I think it's ordinary resolution that they can be prohibited. But if everybody votes in favour of proxies, well, that's the surest sign yet, isn't it, that you're probably a minority in that case, which goes to one of the questions that's been asked here. And the question there relates to proxies for committee members. There are certain restrictions on proxy use for committee meetings, not so much at general meetings. There are some. Yeah.
No. And I suppose if committee members have gathered a whole heap of proxies and retained control that way, that's probably partially a legislative thing. So, I mean, even in Queensland, BCCM proxies can't be used for certain things. For example, changing module, voting on management rights agreements, committee elections, and that sort of stuff. Whereas under BUGTA, they're not as restricted. So, before BCCM arrived in Queensland in '97, the proxy wars of the early 90s and the late 80s were extraordinary things where massive groups of people or particular groups of people were gathering proxies from everyone they possibly could. So voting at general meetings was, I suppose, almost 100%, but it really came down to who swang with who on which day.
Yep. A couple of questions there we might get to. How do you check proxies at a Zoom meeting? Well, if you're going to hold a Zoom meeting, then it's based upon the idea that it is inclusive, encourages participation, and that all of the same sort of things that you should be able to do at an in-person meeting are available via the Zoom meeting. That's the whole concept. The government has not specifically legislated for Zoom meetings yet, he says mysteriously, but the basic concept is if you can inspect a proxy at an in-person meeting, you should be able to do it at a Zoom meeting as well.
And they're certainly body corporate records, so you're entitled to inspect them after the event as well. And that's one of the disputes we have quite often in terms of why it's unnecessary sometimes for lawyers to be at meetings, because certainly the way it works in Queensland is you've got a 3-month window to challenge any resolution or any vote that you think has an issue with it. So there's no point sometimes going along and having a massive stand-up Barney with the chairperson from the floor about whether something should be considered or not, because your rights to have that fight ultimately will be ventilated in Chris's former office after the event. So,
and we used to say that all the time, Frank. When people would ring very concerned about what they thought a meeting would decide, we would say to them, let the meeting happen. Let's see if it actually happened. There are many cases in which people were absolutely convinced a particular motion was going to pass and then found out it didn't for whatever reason. So let it happen, then think about exercising your rights, as Frank has just said. Good point, Frank. Let's question there from Graham. Should all owners get notice of meetings? If it's a general meeting, yes. If it's a committee meeting, you might be.
Which module you're under, doesn't it? So, and I suppose one of the big differences between the modules, particularly between standard and accommodation, is standard modules should give owners notice of the meeting to come. Accommodation is only providing owners notice of the decisions at the committee meeting once it's been made.
Let's flip over, Frank. How about you do a do? Gee, that didn't sound right, did it?
Do a do?
Yeah.
Well, I suppose
have you still got the list? Or?
I do have the list, no, it's all good. So really, I suppose one of the other things that I suppose you've heard it loud and clear today as well is people should put their hands up to participate. So that is either in the voting process or on committee or even, and I suppose in a sense, there's no real structure for these things, subcommittees and otherwise. I have seen people who, with full committees who have effectively wheeled in others to help on a particular project if they've got the skill set to be able to do it. So there's no restriction on being able to do that. But, Chris, the don't would then be?
Don't complain if you don't participate or don't even vote. So if you don't put up your hand, if you don't say that you're going to be engaged, that's great. That's your choice. And you might have some valid reasons for not doing that. But you don't then get the right to sit on the sidelines and complain about that. This is a point on which I'm pretty strong, actually. Nothing irritates me more than people in a body corporate whose sole point in life is to snipe from the sidelines at those people who are actually executing some of their legislated obligations when they themselves either have not put up their hand, or, let's be quite frank about this, if they did put up their hand, there's no way in hell they would ever get support because of who they are. Sorry, but that's just the reality of the situation. Yeah, you can either be part of the solution or you're part of the problem, frankly.
Absolutely. And the next one really, and this is a bit of a no-brainer, but remain financial. Because if you must pay your levies.
Yep.
End of story. Because if you don't, you get disenfranchised, you're prohibited from voting, participating, potentially even being on committee, subject to how you were nominated, participate in committee if the regulations change, Chris. We'll get there with that, I suppose. Pay your levies. And one of the things with body corporate levies is they are really hard to contest once they're struck.
Yep. Wow.
So pay them and argue later, as opposed to not pay them and then try to have a fight about why things are unfair.
Yep. Absolutely. It's a choice between fighting over the principle of maybe $1,000 as opposed to losing your right to cast a vote in something that's really important. The flip side, though, is don't go around accusing other people of being unfinancial or challenge their validity to vote unless you're pretty sure about it, because you can actually come severely unstuck on that sort of thing. It can be a big waste of time, a big waste of money, and just make the situation a whole lot worse. So it's all well and good to suggest that Joan in Unit 1 is not financial, or that she's got some sort of collusive relationship with a service contractor. Do you like that one? Collusive relationship, Frank?
As opposed to a corrosive one?
Yeah. So it's all well and good to say that, but you need to know what you're talking about, and you need to be reasonably sure about that before you go around saying that sort of thing. Really important. Couple of questions, because we are, gosh, time flies. We are running out of time. Follow-up question to general meeting: must it be 21 days notice? In some cases, no, it must not be. An adjudicator can order a much shorter time frame if it's an urgent or an emergency.
Yeah, we did one on 7 days notice for the raising of a special levy of $3 million post the floods in 2011 Brisbane, which was extraordinary.
Yep, can actually be shorter than that too in some cases. I've seen them shorter than that, but they really should be 21 days unless done away with by some other method, i.e. an adjudication order. How do you know if your standard or accommodation module? It will be in what's called your community management statement, CMS for short. If you're an owner, you should have a copy of that as part of the sale documents. If you don't, you can get a copy of that from the titles office.
Or the body corporate manager should certainly have a copy too.
Yep. Next question. If the committee is called an EGM and failed to add motions submitted by owners throughout the year, what would you advise? Manager has been advised. Well, there's a couple of ways of looking at this. Frank, you go first.
Yeah, okay. Because I've just helped a client with this today. They've got their agenda for their AGM at the end of September, and the material they submitted before the end of the body corporate's financial year at 30 June was not on it. So where we've got to on that one is we have gone to the body corporate manager, who has acknowledged their mistake and has agreed to send it out as an additional motion with less than 21 days notice, and we're going to do that and see what the outcome is. So that's just an oversight. They forgot, they've apologised, end of story. And our motion, I suppose, isn't of substantial commercial importance. It's more a matter of principle. So at that stage, our client is happy with that one. So that's that approach. But quite often it's a mistake.
Yeah. This query is about an EGM, which I think is a slightly different kettle of fish.
It is too, sorry. Yeah, well, from a Queensland perspective, if you've submitted a motion and the committee calls a general meeting as opposed to the AGM, that motion must go on the agenda if it's practicable to do so. So what's practicable? Good question. Actually, and Chris, I suppose I've never advised on that. Well, not in recent times.
Yeah, look, the way I'd see it, Frank, is that the whole point of an EGM, extraordinary general meeting, is that word extraordinary. It's something that is unplanned. So therefore, this is my view on it. By definition, if there is an extraordinary general meeting, then it is usually on a specific issue and a specific motion. It's not necessarily for the consideration of a whole bunch of motions that have been accumulated over 12 months. That's how I would tend to see it.
Yeah, okay. We've got a slight difference of opinion, because my view would be is if I fired a motion in, committee's called an EGM for the end of September, if I fired a motion in somewhere in June and it's not on that agenda, I think I'm legitimately dirty on that, because I put something to the committee or the body corporate that should be on agenda for a general meeting if they called, and if they haven't chosen to include it,
I agree. I agree with that. What about though the idea that if the EGM has been called for a big deal, a big issue, Is there a chance that your motions get swamped in that?
Yes.
Is it actually strategically a good idea?
No, sometimes not. Absolutely. And I think that's probably where, from a best practice perspective, if I could steal your line, that would be the committee going back to me saying, Frank, you know, we know this is important to you, but we've got this $3 million loan we're trying to put through. So if we put your motion on that, it is going to get lost because the arguments are going to be about that. So do you want us to hold it back?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So there's no straightforward answer on that one, but if you want some specific advice, email us because it probably will be quite specific. We have just about reached the end today. I don't think we even got halfway through the do and don't list, Frank. So clearly we're going to need a sequel on this one. But I'm going to leave you with one of the big things about meetings which really grinds my gears. And I think it does for you too, Frank. There is no such thing as general discussion or general business at a body corporate meeting. So there's this misconception that you rock on up to the meeting and the very last item is everybody sitting around and having a chit chat endlessly about things at the body corporate. You can do that if you want, but it does not get recorded. No decision gets made and therefore it's a pointless endeavor. There's no such thing. I firmly, and I might get into a bit of trouble saying this, but I'm of the belief that a well-run body corporate meeting should be over in 5 minutes. Frank?
100% with you. And the sooner we have electronic voting where all this stuff's done online, in theory, you know, to me, the best meetings are, we're not reading everyone the motions. We're assuming that they are read. We're not going to run through, hopefully everyone who has voted already. So the body corporate manager is up the front of the meeting with all the tallies. If we're voting from the floor, it should be anyone against, abstain, next, smash it out. No discussion if we can avoid it. And I suppose that's a separate topic we can talk about. But it should be yes, no, abstain, yes, no, abstain, yes, no, abstain, done.
Yep. I agree.
We've both been at meetings that have lasted 3 or 4 hours.
Yeah,
so
it's a big waste of time. Speaking of time, we've reached the end of ours. That was a nice segue. As I say, we probably will end up doing a part 2, probably a part 3 and a part 4 on this sort of thing. I know we get lots of questions about meeting conduct in these webinars, so fire them through so that we can potentially answer them in the future webinar. Don't forget, our email address is there on the screen, info@heinzlegal.com.au. If you've got a question that maybe is a bit more detailed and a bit more specific, that's the way to get in touch with us. For now though, Frank, happy Friday.
Spring has sprung. Go enjoy spring.
Absolutely. Thanks everyone. We'll see you next time.
Bye everyone.
Bye-bye.